When you're ready, Stephen, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Rosie. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Financial Management Task Group of the Overview and Scrutiny Commission. My name is Stephen Crowe. I will start proceedings this evening. The first matter on the agenda is election of a chair. The procedure for a task group is it selects a chair from members. We would have normally done this at our July meeting, but that was cancelled because of COVID. So we will now select a chair now. I will be very pleased to serve again as your chair for the coming 12 months. If any other committee member would like to put themselves forward for the role of chair, now is the time to declare yourselves, please. It sounds as if, Peter.
Yes, I'm just slightly concerned there, Stephen, that we didn't simply want to be elected by default, but I think our attitude is rather more positive and affirmative than that. So I personally would be delighted if you would be willing to continue as chair.
Thank you, Peter. Perhaps it should be formally proposed and seconded then.
I'll second it.
Thank you, Natasha. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Is agreed.
Thank you, everybody. I'm delighted to serve once again as chair. So now we move on to the rest of the agenda. There are no apologies for absent. So moving on to item 3, declarations of pecuniary interest. Are there any? No, I didn't think so. Item 4, minutes of the last meeting. So I think the first thing to consider is whether the minutes are factually correct. Does anyone have any queries as to the content of the minutes? No? Okay. Are the minutes agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you. So moving on to matters arising from the minutes. I am looking at page 1. There's a matter of the Bishop Road Bridge insurance claim. And I think, Caroline, you were looking into that and whether an insurance claim was being pursued and to what magnitude. Do you have any news on that, please, Caroline?
So I don't have it to hand, but I don't think the bridge was not insured. We don't insure our bridges, so we won't be able to have a claim specifically for the bridge. I don't know, Roger, if you have an update more specifically.
Peter, this was also brought up in ONS, wasn't it? Or that actually this is an ongoing issue. So I think it's been covered elsewhere, Stephen, if I may.
Thank you, and perhaps we could just note that that is covered elsewhere, Rosie. Thank you. Moving on to page 2 of the minutes, there is data that David Kettler was going to bring to the next meeting, this meeting. I'm assuming that that is actually covered in his report as appendices to the main agenda items. So we'll move on from that. The other action also on page 2 referred to Keith Burns. He was going to do 2 things first. He was going to tell us the minimum and maximum payments made out under the disability related allowance. I haven't heard anything about that. I think we possibly need to chase him up on that. Rosie, is that an action that you could take from this meeting to chase Keith up on the minimum and maximum payments?
No problem, Chair. Yeah, I'll do that.
The other action on Keith was this issue about increasing the £10 per week disability related allowance. Now, if you remember, we had a presentation from Michael Turner of Merton Sill, and my recollection is he spoke very powerfully about the £10 allowance, the fact that it had been unchanged for many years, from memory, I think he said it'd been unchanged from 10 years, and that maybe the council could consider increasing this. Caroline, in principle, is there any reason, I realise it's just adding to costs, as it were, but is there any reason why the council shouldn't increase this if it's been the same for 10 years?
It's an adult social care policy. So I suppose it depends how it fits with other policies that they may have. So again, if we get Keith to come back on that.
Okay. I'm just wondering, this is kind of a question I think for Peter. The task group can make recommendations to the overview and scrutiny panel that can make proposals or recommendations to the cabinet. Is this something, assuming the task group agrees, that we should or would like to recommend to the overview and scrutiny commission for referral to the cabinet? As you can gather, I'm quite keen to increase this £10 per week. Peter.
I do recall that when we discussed it, we were all, I think, firmly of the view that it should be increased, and that the fact it hadn't been reviewed for so long was really something of a scandal. So yes, we do. I think this group is the more effective. It can make recommendations back to the commission, and we would certainly want to then take that on to cabinet.
Oh, and we can't hear you. Oh, and did you want to say something because you're on mute? No. Okay. Well, do I take it that's agreed, and we'll make a recommendation to the Overview and Scrutiny Commission? Okay. I'll speak to you later, Rosie, about the wording of that, but I think it's quite clear what we want to do.
Okay, and Councillor Southgate is seconding that proposal.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Are we going to say an amount, or again wait for Keith on that?
No, well, we could say an amount.
No.
If we think that's appropriate, but I would suggest it's more a question of we invite the cabinet to review the allocation, because it hasn't changed for many years, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Could we look at what other local authorities offer for their disability related expenditure?
Chair, if I may.
Yes, Owen.
Look, I think we don't set the methodology. We can just say to the cabinet to invite it. They'll direct the officers, and the officers will do it in any way as per normal. They may compare it to others. They can use a number of yardsticks. What I don't think we can be in the business of generally is right now just giving sort of directions to cabinet that increase costs given the financial pressures. So we must be mindful in any recommendation that we make to ONS, and then ONS makes the cabinet, that anything must be reviewed in light of the financial pressures, which are extraordinary at the moment. So as long as that's captured and caveated and we're not prescriptive, I think they should go ahead.
Yes, I agree with that, Owen. It's a general invitation for cabinet to consider it. Okay.
Okay. Good.
Thank you very much. So we move on now to agenda item 5, which is the outturn report for last year. Caroline, will you be presenting this item, or will that honour fall to Roger?
I'll take the honour, as it were, but certainly the officers on the call were very instrumental in the preparation and delivery of it. So as you see, it does seem a long time ago since we looked at sort of 2019-20. There is a lot of information here. This was reported to Cabinet, and there will be an update to Standards and General Purposes Committee on Tuesday next week about the final accounts and the progress the external auditor has made with auditing those accounts. As you can see on page 6, looking at the general fund, we had a favourable outturn balance of 1.7 million, which was a change from the January forecast. And then we had some additional grants, and the most significant grant that we got just before year end, which caused all sorts of accounting issues for us, but clearly helped our financial situation, was the COVID emergency funding that we received of 4.8 million. So MHCLG was very good in getting those monies out the door, but it just didn't quite help our accounting. So you will see that for 2019-20, so whilst mainly in March, we actually spent about 171,000 on COVID, and clearly those costs have increased significantly during 2020-21. In the end, corporate services, children's services and adult social care all underspent. There was quite a swing on children's schools and families from what they had previously been forecasting. So we've done a lot of work with them during the course of this year, which is also continuing to see how the growth that they receive, what it means, and in particular changes around the dedicated schools grant. Environment and regeneration, I think we're beginning to see the impact of the slowdown of travel and of parking and visitors. So there was quite a significant impact there on parking income already beginning to come through last year. We set out what we have done with those surplus funds. So from the general fund reserve, we transferred those monies to the outstanding council programmable reserve. The aim was at the time to make sure that we could fund major transformation projects, and I'll give you an update on what we are actually looking to do with those monies. And the additional grant funding we have actually transferred to a COVID reserve. So there was some additional adult social care or social care funding. So we've added that to our COVID emergency funding, because we're very clear, and you will see from the Q1 monthly monitoring report, we do not have sufficient funding to cover all of our costs. We have also within the report a breakdown of, as we go through the monitoring, detailed information on each of the departments, and then we have an update on the reserves that we have set aside, earmarked reserves to help with future pressures, and some of which the majority of which had already been budgeted for. So you can see, I'm just trying to find sort of the pages. It's but sometimes easier with paper copies, but still able to do that. So on page 36 and 37, we set out the details of those reserves. So far, there has not been any changes as a result of the audit to those amount of reserves. And you can see that the dedicated schools grant now has quite a significant deficit, as we had been reporting during the course of 2019-20 and made additional budget provision during 2021. Capital, there was a slowdown in capital, and in particular people being able to get out and value some of the works that had been undertaken. So there was more of an underspend than had been previously been reported. However, we had anticipated a lower level of spend funding wise, so there hasn't necessarily been the upside that you would have thought having such a lower level of spend. We also had some significant slippage into future years, so that was taken to Cabinet and approved, and updates to the capital programme. We've also done some further works which come out more in the Q1 report, which I'll come on to more in that, but just around slippage, further slippage, changes to the programme, and reviewing schemes to make sure that they are relevant and essential in light of the financial situation we find ourselves in. We also have the debt report, which is, I'm just trying to find, set out on page 69, which is then quite useful to be able to compare against the Q1 report, to be able to see, because this was the normal report that we have done. We have not made additional provisions for council tax or business rates and parking in light of the situation that we were aware of, because it was still very early days, but there will be significant changes to those bad debt provisions during the course of 2021 as we come out of the process and see what, as we start to recover more debts, to see what impact that is going to have on our debt recovery going forward. There was also the update of the establishment control and vacancy reporting. So that's come as part of this report, and that's what has been circulated later for the Q1 report. So there's quite a lot of information there, and happy to take questions if you want to go through the report in more details. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Caroline. I think it's worth noting at the bottom of page 6 that there's a note there saying that the favourable outturn was 1.7 million, and that's a quarter of 1% of the gross spend, which of course is in excess of 500 million. So actually, I think that the finance team, corporate services team, are to be congratulated on their monitoring of the council spend and bringing the year-end outturn very closely into line with the budget for last year. So I think that's a very positive sign. So thank you, Caroline and team. We have an established way of going through this report, as it were, section by section. So I suggest we keep with that routine. And I invite colleagues' questions on section 2, the outturn, before you move through the report. Any questions in relation to the overview at section 2? Shall we move on to section 3 then, the detailed service spending, which starts on page 9. Peter.
It's a general question. Running through this is a number of mentions of not recruiting to vacant posts, and yet also increased expenditure on agency staff. And I'm always slightly concerned that not recruiting to vacant posts is not a sustainable way of doing things in the long term. But is there something more complicated going on here? Particularly the increase in use of agency staff.
So the complication is we're looking to review the top structure within corporate services, and therefore having some flexibility around those posts are not filling on a permanent basis, but still needing resources and capacity to get us through certain things. And certainly one of those posts was our head of comms and sort of customer engagement. So clearly, luckily played a crucial role with some of the engagement that we've had with the report that you had at the commission last week. So that's sort of trying to have that flexibility and agile approach to some of the things that need to be done.
Okay, thank you.
I actually have a question myself on this section. On page 10, there's reference to a favourable variance of £586,000 in relation to Microsoft licenses. It sounds like a slightly strange variance to have arisen, and I wondered if you could give us some further detail and explanation.
So we had allowed for 2 years, but we shouldn't have done. So it was a fortuitous over provision. So that was just the understanding of it. But Microsoft licenses are very expensive, and so that's rare to get such a benefit from that.
Then on page 12, there's a question. There's a comment that the corporately funded items budget has a favourable variance of £233,000, and it was not required. I didn't quite understand what was not required. Any of the budget.
So I think that was the budget that we have set aside for redundancy payments. So we didn't have large numbers of staff being made redundant, so therefore it was not required.
Okay, super. Thank you. Any other questions on section 2? Sorry, section 3. So that concludes section 3. So we move on to section 4, corporate items.
Skipped over.
That's on page 12. Then moving on to I suppose page 16, children, schools and families. Any questions in that area? I have a question in relation to page 17. It's the rather difficult issue of the SEN transport. There's of course a history to this. We seem to always under budget and then spend a bit more, and it seems to be very difficult to get a handle on what the likely expenditure is until it's incurred. And obviously it's going to become more difficult because of the impact of COVID on providing transport for our SEN pupils. So I was just really kind of wondering or asking for a general comment about whether this area of spend is in fact well under control, or is it something that we are looking to take further interest in and have a more tighter or a different approach to monitoring the SEN transport spend?
So I would say, Chair, that there's always a lot of interest in this area, and making sure what we set aside is sufficient. There is a transport review being looked at by the Directors of Education, Directors of Environment Regeneration, Community and Housing, and Children's Schools and Families, to see about the level of transport that will be required, different ways of doing it. We have a contract for the taxis for mainly the school transport. We are looking at the retender of that to make sure that we have the more appropriate routes. But clearly it can be very difficult because you don't know the children who are going to require it, because we still have such an increase in the education, health and social care plans coming through, which can trigger then the school to transport requirement. Certainly during the course of this year, we are now seeing, because of with the schools being mainly closed the beginning part of the COVID wave 1 situation, that we have a slight underspend. But we are waiting to see what the impact of social distancing, parents' approach to transport will be as we go forward with the start of the academic year a couple of weeks ago. So it's being kept, I think, very tightly under review to see what it is. Clearly, we put some growth into this area for 2021, but this was based on the latest estimates that we had from Children's Schools and Families. So we're just working through to see whether that is still sufficient or what more can be done in this area.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Quick question, Chair, if I may, on that.
Yeah.
We had asked that there be, as is pretty much every year, there's quite a significant overspend. I think we'd suggested previously it'd be really helpful to see a standalone report on the subject, going through the various options that might be available to try and better understand or manage that cost. What are the options? Is there, there's a whole load of different things I know which were discussed in various parts at the CYP scrutiny panel. But I think we felt that there could be a benefit from a standalone report on the subject, setting out the different options, what's available, what might not be available, what might be helpful, what might not be helpful, and so on, just so that can come before, if not this panel. It sounds like it might be something for the CYP panel. I don't know what the plan is, because it's such an important issue, and it's one with 7-figure overspend most years. So I think there'd be a benefit in a scrutiny of a standalone report on the subject, of setting out the options.
Chair, if I may.
Yes, Owen.
I just remind the committee and you, Chair, that was done 2 years ago. There was an investigation done by this committee where we actually spoke to the directors. We looked at risk and outturn variance. We talked about how risk and financial risk was calculated in regards to specific directorates, and how we as an organisation pool it together across as the whole. We investigated it and went through it. We saw the outcomes, and what and ultimately it is a way that financial risk is managed as an organisation. And as that hasn't changed, I probably see little desire to put more time and effort into examining what we know to be the same, when actually we've got pressing concerns about COVID related costs, which to use officers' times.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think there are arguments on both sides here. We did do the risk review, as you said, and we did speak to those managers responsible for the SEND transport budget. I think we were expecting things would get more controlled. I'm not sure they have, but I think maybe we pick this up when we get to item 7 on the agenda about work programme for the coming 12 months. Because while SEN might be high on the list of priorities, as you suggest, Owen, COVID and other things might be higher still. So let's come back to that under item 7. So moving on then, any questions in relation to children, schools and families, starting on page 16? No?
I have
Okay.
a question.
Oh, yes, please.
On page 17, your last sentence or last paragraph, the children with disability team is holding a vacant post. Are you saying there's a vacant post at the moment? And are you saying that funding from that vacant post will be used within fostering service? Can you just explain that a little bit more for me so I can understand what you're saying? It's the last,
Sorry.
yeah, it's the last sentence on page 17.
Yeah. Yes. So there is some additional requirement for the fostering service. So the additional capacity for work there is being funded through the Children's Disabilities team by holding those posts vacant.
Okay.
So there is sort of the flexibility by managers to make sure that they can put the resource where it's most needed. And if they don't necessarily need to recruit in the short term to that Children with Disabilities team, but they have some pressures in the fostering service, because clearly if we can reduce in external fostering placements, that helps both the child and the costs, then that's more beneficial.
Right, thanks.
Peter.
Thank you, Chair. Page 20, can someone explain the Mockingbird model to me?
We may have to come back to you on the specific details of that, but that's an approach being taken, I think started out, I think in the States, a different way of working, but we can get some information from Children's Schools and Families to share with the panel, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, if we move on then, community and housing on page 27. Are there any queries in connection to the community and housing outturn? No. Okay. Section 6 then, page 36. Does anyone wish to question any of the information about reserves? No. Section 7 then, the capital section. We have this slippage, of course, from 2019-20 into 2021, a slippage of 3.7 million, which I think kind of speaks for itself.
And I suppose, Chair, just to draw your attention to the fact that clearly at the time we were writing the report, we weren't fully aware of the financial situation of TfL, but TfL have now confirmed that the level of funding we would normally expect for our road schemes is not there, but any ones that we had committed to, they will agree still to fund.
Yeah, fine. Natasha.
Just there's a mention here about the Office 365 being suspended because of the COVID response. And I was just wondering if and when that work could start. So I imagine with a lot of people working from home and kind of, you know, relying a lot more heavily on tech to get through, and also us doing meetings like this, I wonder if there's a plan to kind of get that back up and running so that we can be as efficient as possible.
So it has already started, and the rollout has restarted, and we're looking to complete it by December. And certainly Microsoft Teams is one of the benefits of that rollout, so we're utilising that much more now.
Okay, that's good.
Hello, might I ask a question, please?
Yes, Simon, of course.
Sorry, this is, as you know, I'm a new boy, so this may be very ignorant. The strategic SIL is down £730,000. Why is that?
What page are you referring to, Simon?
39. Sorry, am I on the wrong page?
No, that's fine. I can go back. That's fine.
So that's how we funded the programme. So there wasn't the spend on those schemes which we could utilise the SIL funding for. What it may mean is that there's been slippage into 2021 for those schemes. Okay. I think so, if that's right.
Okay, thank you.
All right, okay, that's fine.
So I think we then move on to Appendix 4, which is the debtors position, is on page 69. I think it's worth noting page 75, which shows the debts written off over the last 6 years. And it shows a steady reduction in the debts written off. So I think it's well done to David Kepler and his team. This seems like a very good run of debt management procedures. So well done, David, and thank you. It's, I think, a little unfortunate that the trend's going to go the other way as a result of COVID, but I'm afraid that's the way these things happen. Is there anything anyone would like to ask about the debt report? Peter.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just one item is going back to page 69. One invoice of over 820,000 unpaid now with legal. Can you tell us more about that, and perhaps more pertinently the chances of recovery?
Sorry, what page was that, Councillor?
Page 69, talking about environment and regen. Is it part of a SIL debt?
It's likely to be part of a SIL debt.
Okay.
So I'm just trying to think, when I looked at the SIL debts at the end of June, I don't think that debt was outstanding. And I know we've recently had a £300,000 payment on a separate SIL debt that had been outstanding for ages. I can check that and come back to the panel if you want.
So you think this may be overtaken by events? Yeah,
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
David, perhaps you could send Rosie an email or something.
Yeah.
And do whatever it is in the minutes.
Yeah. And Chair, my action from the last meeting was regarding a breakdown of the adult social care debt by residential and home care, and it isn't in the report. I didn't and we struggled to get that information exactly as a debt. But what I've managed to get is the actual budget or invoices raised, if you like, with a breakdown. So for 1920, residential care was 4 million and non-residential was just over 1.3 million. So approximately 25%. Now, apologies, I didn't get that information until fairly late in August. I'm sure colleagues probably had something better to be doing than answering my emails on a breakdown of debt.
Okay, well, thank you. I mean, I guess that's ratio of residential to non-residential is potentially going to change over the coming year, again, down to COVID. But thank you for doing that research for us.
Okay.
I think we then move on to the other appendices, and probably the HR report, which starts on page 88, Appendix 6. Does anyone have any questions they wish to raise or comments they wish to make in relation to this report? I just have one kind of observation to make myself, and that is, if you look at page 92, one can see that the budgeted headcount from June 2018 at the foot of the page up until March 2020 at the top of the page is about 1,800. And if one looks at the variances, which is the third column in from the right, during that period, the vacancies goes from about 380 odd to 450, so about 400. So that means that vacancies as a proportion of headcount is about 22%. Now, not all those vacancies are unoccupied positions, because about half of them are filled by temps, and about another half are in fact vacant. So my question really is this level of vacancies, in accordance with what is a standard practice or best practice? It just strikes me as very high, this 22% figure, and I just wonder whether there are plans to look into this and perhaps lower the percentage of vacancies.
So certainly when we start the budget process, an area to look at is vacant posts, and we need to see why posts are vacant and those that are genuinely not covered. Some of them may be held vacant to cover, as we saw, provision in other areas like the disability team and the children foster care team. So there is that analysis. Some we just still really struggle to recruit to, and that's why we've been trying with some of our apprenticeship schemes to grow our own. But that's certainly something we are looking at as part of the approach to close out our budget gap for next year, over the next 3 years. So sort of the approach across the board, a corporate approach to staff, to resources, to agency, just to see if there's something that can be done.
Do we have any idea whether this kind of 22% figure is kind of standard for London councils, or are we an outlier?
I don't know if authorities do the analysis in this way. I know that we certainly struggled when we were as part of the partnership with Kingston and Sutton, when we wanted stab controls. The other boroughs didn't have this level of detail, so it may not be something that's easily available, but I'll ask Liz to look into that for you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that probably brings the report on the outturn for this year to its end. Before we move off this item, is there anything that people want to ask, which they haven't had the chance to ask so far? Okay, let us move on to item 6 on the agenda.
Sorry, Stephen, there was just one item just on the reserves, actually, just a really quick one. Sorry for not doing it. There was a new reserve, which I think was just wanted to hear the spending review reserve, which has, you know, moved from, I think, 0 up to 7 million over 7.7 million over the last couple of years. Sorry, not reading to it's page 37. As you gave us an opportunity, and I just wanted to hear, useful to hear from Caroline, what that is intended for and how that has arisen, you know, from 0 up to 7.7 over the last couple of years. If you should provide a bit more information on that particular line entry, thank you very much.
Page 37, I haven't quite found your figure yet.
Yeah, it's halfway down the list of earmarked reserves, I guess. And you'll see on there's a spending review reserve.
Oh, spending review reserve.
Yeah, which one I hadn't actually picked up previously. So I just wanted to hear what that, yeah. It's gone up from 0 to 7.7, I think, as of the end of the financial year. So it'd just be good to hear how that's different from, for example, from one of the other ones, like for use in future years budgets reserve or something like that. If Karen could kindly just provide a little more information on that particular line entry, just to clarify it a bit.
So certainly the spending review reserve has been set up for the last couple of years to cover the dedicated schools grant deficit. So the deficit was 2.9 million in 18-19, but there was some other monies that was still required for schools, so therefore it was 3.1 million that we set aside. During the course of 2019-20, any underspends because of the size of the deficit, we set further monies aside, and that was reported through Cabinet in the monitoring report, and as part of the dedicated schools grant report that came through separately to Cabinet, I think in January, which showed the scale of the deficit over the 5 years. We said that we would be setting further monies aside, and this would be part of this reserve. The further monies we set aside in 2020-21 of the 16 million will be going into this reserve. We're very clear we are not putting monies directly into the dedicated schools grant. We're holding monies to offset it, because that's the current accounting practice, although we are reviewing it along with other boroughs, external auditors, DFE and MHCRG.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Good. So we move on to agenda item 6, the financial report for the first 3 months of this new year. Caroline, are you leading on this again?
Yes, I suppose I never thought in all the years as a Section 151 officer I would introduce a report saying we have a £23.7 million deficit. So that is clearly significant, very unusual. And as you will see, we're trying to, the information we've then set out for you, try to explain how that's arisen, what we're doing about it, and how the funding that we're getting currently from government offsets some of it, but clearly not all of it. And therefore that also then plays into the report which went to Cabinet in September about our gap going forward. What we have tried to identify, so on sort of page 99, there's a COVID forecast column of 26.9 million, as well as then the net figure. So there are some areas where there are some underspends and there are some overspends that aren't related to COVID. So what we're trying to do as much as possible is identify COVID expenditure issues, as well as then other expenditure issues that may occur. So one of those expenditure issues is some increased costs in relation to Councillor Irons to Office 365, So we need to find, we've got some additional monies there as part of that rollout and license costs that we need to find provision for in future years, but that's part of our, I would say, a non-COVID cost. We have also then drawn a summary table on page 100 of where COVID costs are being spent on a departmental basis, and that's as much as possible where if there's an impact within a department. So again, within corporate services, we have a reduction in our income from either enforcement fees or summonses. We will be showing that item of expenditure within corporate services. Where we have provided services over and above, like our community hub, some of the food that we have been giving, some of the support to the voluntary sector, then that is shown within the corporate items and shortfall there on savings as well. You can see that at this time we only had the 11.6 million of grant. We did have a further 1.5 million through as part of the 500 million share of the third tranche of funding, and that is reflected certainly in the later monitoring reports which went to September Cabinet. We are due some support towards our income losses, but we have to swallow the first 5% of any loss, and then we get 75% of those which we can claim for transactional income. Not all of our income that we see is lost due to COVID, we are able to recover. So we hope, and this is changing as we go through, that the information that we've pulled together assists you with what needs to be done to help you understand the impacts of COVID as well as other things going on within the departments. Clearly, you will see further increases in our education, health and social care plans, which feed into then an increase in our dedicated schools grant forecast. There are also some areas where, because people have been focused so much on COVID, that some of the business as usual may have slipped or may not have been done to the same level. So there may be some catch up later on the year, or it may be that there are some areas where we will cease some of that function and then it will never come back to the right level during the course of this year. There are also areas where some of the monitoring is not done necessarily to the same standard as it would have ordinarily been, just because of where the focus is. But certainly as we are going further forward, and currently whilst before we hit wave 2, we're doing some further work to try and ensure that what the monitoring we bring to you is as accurate as it can be, to make sure that the situation we're then in for 21-22 and the budget gap that we've got is minimised as far as we can. There is clearly the normal detail that we have going through on a departmental basis, but you will see that the debt report that we have attached for this report is slightly different, because clearly, and it's been a bit of, again, an anathema for me, where we have stopped a lot of our recovery. We have tried to defer some of the debts, encourage people as much as possible to contact us. And so you will see that the debt that was outstanding at March of 14.3 million on page 156 has now risen to 18.7 million. So we are looking at ways that we can encourage people and keep in touch with people, because clearly we don't want them to be in debt for a long period of time. The longer they're in debt, the harder it is for them to get back on their feet. So we want to encourage people as much as possible to contact us to set up repayment plans whilst the enforcement activities has been halted. Clearly, enforcement activity has now been allowed by the government from the middle of August. We have not currently looked to engage our enforcement activity, but we are looking to see what actions we can take against certainly parking enforcement notices, as well as some council tax arrears that may have been outstanding before the start of COVID, to just try and encourage people to make some payments to be able to reduce that level of debt. You will see that there has been a reduction in the level of business rates and council tax received, and therefore that will have an impact on future years' budget deficits. And some of these savings, some of the work and energy has been diverted elsewhere. So again, there are some delays in achieving the savings and trying to flag what impact that will have in future years. So there's quite a lot of information there, and in a very different way. So happy to take questions again in the similar way to the previous report, Chair.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Before I throw it open to colleagues to ask questions, I'd just like to clarify something about the legal position of the budget. I'd always assumed, and this may be wrong, but I always assumed there was a legal obligation on the council to set a balanced budget. And in practice, this meant one could make a small transfer to reserves of either a small deficit or a small surplus. But under the current COVID circumstances, it seems to me that we might be in a situation at the end of the financial year of making a large deficit transfer to reserves, or large release of reserves, if you like. And I just wonder whether that meets how that plays with my assumption of a legal obligation to set a balanced budget.
So what we have been looking at is how we can balance the budget in the current financial year. So yes, we do legally have to set a balanced budget, and we did do that. What you don't have to do is necessarily come in on budget. And as you saw, we did have a small over provision, and we're able to allocate some money to reserve. So what we are looking at is the level of grant funding that we are receiving. Are there reserves that we can earmark to be able to offset this? And clearly we do have a general fund balance, which is normally set aside for a rainy day. But I think at the moment you could say that size of overspend in the account, it's pouring. So we would be looking to call on that general fund balances, and that's then part of the challenge for future years, how we look to settle and deliver a balanced budget. That's why the savings target of 16.7 million for next year is so large, because the assumptions are made around replacing some of those balances to ensure that we have sufficient funding going forward. So that's then the dilemma once you use those balances, as Councillor Southgate has always been made very clear, they're one-offs, and therefore you normally have to replace some of those. So that's then the challenge and dilemma that we have. There are some London boroughs that are looking to set emergency budgets for this year. I don't think we're in that position so far, but we are keeping a close eye on the resources, and therefore that's why encouraging budget managers to be very clear around the monies they've got, what they're using it for, and if there are areas of underspend, so like home to school transport, where there was clearly less provision being provided, therefore we should see an underspend in that area currently to know how much headroom we've got before there may be some increased costs coming through. So I would say a much more complicated monitoring position and budget position than I have ever known.
No, it is going to be a difficult period, no doubt. Colleagues, shall we start with the executive summary and work our way through the report? Are there any questions in relation to the executive summary on page 99 or the following page 100? Paul.
It's a very minor point, but I see on the business rate and the council tax and collection fund, and I note what you say with the asterisks. Why can't one simply reflect the under collection in the forecast? Why is it not possible to just reflect it like everything else?
Because of the way the collection fund, it has its own account, and the way that you allow for it is normally deficits picked up in the following year. Okay. So again, that's a fund that's not allowed to go into deficit. But if you are on the Standards and GP committee next week, you will see as part of this statement of accounts, we have the general fund accounts, pension fund accounts, and we have a collection fund as part of that. So you will see that there as well. And also the monies, part of it goes back to government, part goes to the GLA.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Sorry, one question on that, Chair, if I may, just looking at bottom of page 99, top of 100, and it refers to the 75p in the pound. So just reading this for the first time, it says the details of this are yet to be published and not included in the financial forecast. So is that within the sort of autumn or year-end settlement, we expect to see the details of that provision, and then you will include something, or when do you expect to see the detail of that, and when will any numbers from that be included in the within the financial inventory, or is it already included in some manner? So
it's certainly not within the current forecast, and that's what I was saying. There are some items of income we will not get reimbursed for. So we are working through, the details have since been published, but we are working through what that does mean. There is a return to be completed and sent back to MHCLG by the end of this month, and then we will look to reflect depending on the processes that MHCLG need to go through to allow for us to account for it. So it'll probably be November at the earliest before we know what the position is and how much we can get.
And then you kind of get the settlement towards the year end, but there's also the comprehensive spending review, terminology correct. And what's happening with the comprehensive spending review, which doesn't just look to the next financial year, but we want to be waiting for it and keep getting delayed. But I thought that had been, is that still going ahead to look forward to the next 3 financial years? And I thought it had been moved from July to November. So what kind of stuff are you expecting to see within the comprehensive spending? Is it still going ahead? I wonder if you could comment on that. Yeah.
So there's rumours that the budget for November may be deferred till January. There's rumours that the comprehensive spending review will not be comprehensive. It could be 1 year only. So we are still waiting to hear what that means. What we are trying to ask for is that we know early, because the later we know, the more assumptions we have to make, and therefore potentially coming back to Councillor Crow's position about balancing that budget, some of the assumptions there may be wrong, or we may have to take some short half-term decisions which won't be in the best interest of services or residents. So we are asking sort of for minimum funding levels, a guarantee, rollover, because we had a rollover last year, rollover plus because of the additional costs we're facing. The grant that we got, we were told it's for 2021 only. The settlement will pick up everything else. We're not necessarily convinced that will be the case. And at the moment, all of our assumptions do not include significant second wave costs. So if there is a real second wave and further lockdown, then we've got, I think, other financial difficulties to face. So we've set some assumptions out in the budget update report that we took to Cabinet a couple of weeks ago, but until we know more, and we're struggling to get sort of clarity on that.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. And I'm not quite sure if it sits within the executive summary or not, but the top of page 101 is about cash flow. Is that, I guess that is within the executive summary. So I just wanted to ask a quick question on cash. It's quite a strong statement in there, and it says that the council's got sufficient cash flow to meet payment obligations for the foreseeable future and for the medium term without using facilities, I guess. But if you did need to borrow, facilities would be available. So reading that, it's at least in terms of cash flow, it would seem to be quite a, there's no immediate concern, if you like, as regards to cash flow.
Correct.
Peter?
Yes, thank you. Just on that same point, we have been doing very well on outperforming on investment income, haven't we, against budget? Presumably because we've been able to place funds for, fixed maturities. Is the downside to this that we are not able to make such good returns if we're keeping things more liquid?
Roger.
Roger, do you want to take that one?
Can't hear you, Roger.
We can't hear you, Roger. You seem to be unmuted, but we still can't hear you.
Slightly frozen.
Do you fancy a headset, Roger?
You need to unmute himself.
Roger, it sounds as if you need to unmute yourself, or maybe try without the headset sometimes headsets are a problem with Zoom.
No.
I can give a
I'm
quick.
sure it was very wise though, Roger. Caroline, you'll just have to cover for him.
Do your best, Caroline.
We have, because of some of the grants that we've got, we have at the moment more cash than we thought we would have. But as you say, yes, the returns are significantly lower. So we think we will be on budget this year rather than overperforming. So but we're just then trying to see what does that mean going forward as well. But oh, I think Roger may contradict me now.
Can you hear me now at all?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, excellent! I've managed it. Yeah, you're absolutely right. What we normally do is we put the money on a deposit of under 12 months, and we get a fairly good return. Of course, if you want to just place your money in cash deposits, you get a very low return. And what I've been doing just to make sure the council has enough cash, given the uncertainty, is as money that we've had on deposit for a period of time comes back to the council, I've kept it liquid, if you like, and we use something called a money management fund for that, which you only get 0.2%, 0.1% for. You don't get an awful lot of money for it. So whereas in the past we've been able to outperform our budgeted income for treasury management, I anticipate this year we will probably just come in on budget, which obviously is better than an underachievement of income. But what we normally rely on is that I overachieve that income because I'm managing to put the money on deposit. But the rates that we get for putting money out at the moment are very, very, very low, and therefore whereas we will have enough cash to meet our commitments, I'm not getting a very good return on it. I'm sorry for the muting, but I still don't know how it works.
Thank you. Okay. So let us move on now to section 4 of this report, departmental positions. We start with corporate services on page 101. Does anyone have any questions on that?
I suppose, sorry, Chair, I'd just draw your attention to the fact that rather strangely, as a result of COVID, children's schools and families and community and housing are underspending. Corporate services and environment regeneration are overspending. So that's part of the challenge we have going forward. But certainly with the sort of loss of income, particularly in environment and regeneration, you can see how significant that is for them.
Yes, indeed. I just have a question on page 103 about the adverse variance caused by the bailiff service ceasing operation. That 2.3 million, is that because fees aren't being received for collecting debts, or is it because debts aren't being collected, or is it some kind of mixture of both of those?
That's the fees that, yeah, that's the forecast that the fees won't be collected in the year. So the debt, some of the debt is still being collected, but clearly not to the normal level. There's no debts being collected, particularly for council tax for 2021 yet, of which we would normally be doing that by now within the enforcement team. So it's just purely their fees that they collect.
So does that mean that the bailiff service personnel are on furlough for a foreseeable period?
So the admin team are on furlough and were put on furlough in the middle of June. The plan at the moment is to hopefully recommence enforcement work early October. So if that's agreed, then they'll be back working from them. The actual bailiffs have been out. Some of them have been out helping with the hub, helping with deliveries and things like that. So part of the team has been furloughed, and there is a little bit of funding coming back. But the level of funding, I saw July's funding through, I think it was something like £16,000. So it's not a great deal.
Okay. Thank you, understood.
Sorry, David, I'll just pick you up on that, if I may, Chair. Yeah, when you say bailiffs are on furlough, I think council employees and FTs with the council are on furlough. Could you just clarify that? Or
Yeah, so it's not the actual bailiffs or enforcement agents as they're officially called. So they are all working, and like I say, they've been out supporting the food hubs and the food banks and things like that. It's the administrative staff that are employed by the council. So we were able to take advantage of the furlough scheme because the cost of the service is covered by income, and that allowed that service in particular to apply for the furlough scheme.
do you know how many council employees have actually been furloughed under the government furlough scheme? I thought I wasn't aware that any had. Was it? Yeah.
My team, within my team, there's 7 or 6.5, I think it is. Caroline, do you know the rest?
There are 2 in the council. However, schools have furloughed support staff and that, so schools have significantly more, but from the staff control that we were looking at earlier, only 9 in total.
Okay, thank you.
So if we move on to environment and regeneration on page 104, we see the point about parking services adverse variance of 7.6 million, as Caroline pointed out. I think the only thing one can say to that is, wow, that's quite a hit. Any other questions on environment and regeneration?
And I suppose, Chair, just again to alert you to another conundrum. Clearly, as more people are working from home and there's less people working in their offices, there's less commercial waste. So therefore, we are losing income on commercial waste. And there is more costs for disposing of residential waste because it's done by tonnage. And whilst the recycling may be going up, the overall quantum is going up. So there's another cost implication of people working from home there.
Yes, that is interesting. In actual fact, I went to the Garth Road refuse dump myself earlier in the week, yesterday, for exactly that. More than a bin's worth.
Yeah, actually the number's not particularly high. It's 200k, I think, and I had expected it to be a bit larger than that, actually. And yeah, anyway.
So moving on, come to education and children's services. Sorry, children's schools and families, starting on page 107. Is there anything anyone would like to ask on that? Natasha.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Where are we with the dedicated schools grant and getting that rounded up and sorted out so that we can at least get that monkey off our backs that we've had for quite some time?
Well, as I said at the beginning, there are still some challenges around that, so we're not there. There's a bit of debate going on as to who holds deficit on their balance sheets. And there is still the accounting treatment that there's been some disagreement with the external auditors. So it's not clear, but still work in progress. And we're pushing hard because there are some boroughs who are in a worse off position than us with their deficit and their general fund balances being less than their overall deficit. So whilst we're not in that position yet, and that's why we've put some additional monies aside to help, but it's an ongoing debate, but being ramped up the agenda because we are saying therefore some of our reserves are not available to help with COVID because we have to set them aside for the DSG. So that's been quite a useful argument and helping it raise up the agenda, but to solve a different problem.
Ed.
Yeah, just on the DSG, how far off are we seeing? Are we off for seeing any increase in capacity? Because a lot of that cost, of course, I think pretty much all of it relates to the independent provision for EHCP places as opposed to the council's own provision. So what's the pipeline looking like in terms of, building council's own provision, and how, in terms of capacity and timing, are you able to comment on that? Because the more council provision that's provided 3 HCP places, then that will then bring that cost a lot more in control, because you have less spend then, of course, on the independent provision, which is driving that number at the moment.
So if you look at page 135, you'll see our capital programme and our SEN allocations and expansion programme. However, that's already built into our deficit forecast going forward. We don't have a new school site to be able to build that. So we are struggling, along with many other boroughs, to find suitable sites. And just because we have a school place doesn't necessarily mean that will meet the child's requirements or the parents' ask.
Caroline, can I just ask about this discussion with the external auditors about the treatment of the DSG? Is the issue of such magnitude that it might delay sign off of the audited accounts?
I don't think so, not for us, but for some boroughs it might. And that's the conundrum, because different firms appear to have a slightly different view.
Peter, you had a question?
Yes, it's about the EHCPs and the assessment process and the extent to which we can feel it appropriate to challenge there. But I thought I'd not hear, but read that we were in some cases challenging the amounts allocated or awarded. Am I wrong about that, or is the appeals process such that it really is not worth our while to challenge awards?
We very rarely win, because the court will normally favour the parent. But we were doing work with certainly the South London boroughs, where we appear to have sort of clusters and in higher EHCP requirements than other areas. So we're just trying to learn all the time about what we can do, how we can minimise the impact, because not all of the EHCPs result in plan, and there is also, we're still the extension from 0 to 25, we've still got people coming into the system and no one's coming out at the top yet. And indeed, I think there would be quite an increase in pupils over the age of 16 wanting a place from September. So again, we've seen quite an increase in costs coming through for sort of college placements.
Thank you.
So it can be quite tricky.
The next section is community and housing, starting on page 114. Any questions in relation to community and housing? Okay. So I think we then jump on to the capital programme 121, but I think that's effectively almost a repeat of what we looked at in the run-up, the at-turner report. I think we then move on to the appendices. Appendix 1 is corporate items. Appendix 2, pay and price inflation. Appendix 3, treasury. Appendix 5, capital.
Chair, may I?
Of course.
Just an opinion really for an opinion question, as in I want Caroline or Roger's opinion as whether or not they think there's any likelihood of the facility for public sector borrowing, the public Sector Works Board reducing its interest rates as a means of stimulating sort of economic growth, you know, in line with what we've seen this government say it will do, would be more intervention and more Keynesian, if you will. Has there been any talk of that? And if there has been talk of that, is that something you'd be minded to consider, or does it look as if it's staying the same? Thank you.
So I'll give an initial view and then Roger may come in with some further thoughts. There has been a review of PWLB and borrowing and the use of it by authorities. So certainly if you're using it for commercial activities, there's potential for you having access to PWLB limited or having to pay at a higher rate. So we're still, I think, waiting the outcome of some consultation and changes to the rules. So I think
that was for external to, unless I'm mistaken, Caroline, that recommendation was for investments external to one's borough. Yeah. For people taking ownership.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
If it's commercial, it doesn't necessarily mean to be out the borough, and that's the challenge. So, for example, if we borrowed from Morden regeneration, that could now potentially impact on us, and that's what we were trying to get across to government officials. Roger, did you want to?
Yeah, with regards to the PWLB rates, obviously you'll be aware that there was a 1% hike in interest rates some time ago, which caught a lot of local authorities out, and that was designed in some part to stop what Caroline was suggesting, that investment in shopping malls and HQ buildings and stuff like that, the more speculative areas of local authority spending and borrowing. Whether you think that the rates will come down, well, there is sort of one argument where we understand obviously the current government are very keen for infrastructure spending as a means of increasing sort of the economic environment in which we work, and keen to get capital projects off the ground to create employment, etc. So in one sense, they may be minded to reduce the PWLB rates, but I think what's keeping them up at the moment is this general concern, as Caroline outlined, of what government currently perceives to be local authorities borrowing to make more, what you might call more speculative investments. So I think there's a bit of a paradox within government.
And I am probably more than most well aware of both of your views on those kind of investments, but I was more speaking to what Caroline touched on there, which is the Morden regeneration project, and concern that, because getting aside whether or not we can at the same time as regenerate making money and stimulate growth, I personally think you can. I know that that's a view. There is an absolute need to regenerate, and that has been long accepted by this administration. That is Morden, and in turn hopefully going eastwards. That requires capital, that requires borrowing. That seems as if it can only come from, as it currently is, a couple of places, possibly the local government mutual or the PWLB. What's, I suppose the question fundamentally is this regeneration plan for Morden and subsequent regeneration plans for the east of the borough in jeopardy, or is there a chance now that we're going to be able to do it? And I know this is opinion, and the only reason I bring it up is because the Treasury plan is mentioned, and therefore I saw a gateway to bring it within the sort of this agenda point. But I'd be interested to know your views.
So I would say, unfortunately, with the difficulties TfL are currently facing, they are a major partner in Morden regeneration, and they had 54 million of funding. So the money we currently have in the current programme, which was we were putting cash and potentially land into the deal. We didn't necessarily need to borrow for the capital that we were putting in, but if the TfL is short on their funding, then the whole business case needs to be reviewed. So there is a risk around the regeneration, I would say, at this stage.
That's great.
Sorry,
Ed.
There was a GLA tranche of money, so I thought there was 54 million coming from TfL, another 20 odd million or something coming through the GLA as well. Is that also off the table now? Then the 20 million from the GLA.
But the TfL have lost 90% of their income.
Yeah.
So I think everything's off the table until we hear otherwise, really.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think this is, just one of the important things to note, because occasionally, Chair, if I may, that we get caught up in kind of checking that the officers have put the pluses and minuses into the right columns on the report they issue us, and when there's actually there's some really big things happening here, not just in terms of Ardell, which Caroline eloquently explained with the 23 million shortfall, but actually with the place-based regeneration, the shared endeavour that we all have to bridge the gap between East and West, which was dependent on stimulating economic growth, employment, improving quality of lives within those areas. And I think, it's easy to get caught up in the detail, but the takeaway from this is that a lot of this, not just the day-to-day care services, which we count as Ardell, but those big projects and those strategic projects right now are in peril. And the reason that I just want to mention is because I know we're going to come onto the work plan as the next agenda point, and therefore I just think it's worth highlighting here and now what we should be focusing on, so when we move into the work plan we keep our eye on the more important aspects of the ball rather than trying to play amateur accountants. Thank you, Chair.
Good point, Owen, well made. Nigel, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry about it. Please, a point I would like to make. About so far two projects which was supposed to happen in my ward, Abbey ward, but I was then given excuses because there's no funding because of TfL and the COVID, and I find this unacceptable because these projects were planned about 2-3 years ago, and for some reason the council has never got round to it, and then so using those excuses, and I find that unacceptable. Thank you, Chair.
Nigel, were you referring to a specific project? I wasn't quite sure which project you were talking about when you said it.
Oh, sorry. I wanted to make a point about a project which is in my ward, Jupiter Road works for improvement. And it was planned about 5 years ago, but it's been delayed, and then the latest excuses I'm hearing is the funding from TfL and COVID, and I find that's rather bit of a issue because the council could have done the work much earlier. I am only making a point, not a question.
Yeah. Thank you, Nigel. I mean, I think it's the same point that Owen raised, perhaps with a slightly smaller project in mind, and this TfL.
Probably misheard.
I think we move on to Appendix 8 now, which is the more up-to-date debt report. Of course, it shows on page 160 the increase in debtors because of the current situation. Does anyone wish to ask any questions of David on the more up-to-date debt report? No. Okay.
I mean, if I could just raise one, I mean, in terms of arrears and so on, I guess the numbers I had were, I'm not quite sure. When you see them presented, they change quite a bit. When I added up the previous presentation, the numbers, I counted about £25 million of, you know, when you add up all the overpayments, whether it's fraud, error, or whatever. But however they're presented, there's a very large sum out there, and I agree that obviously a lot of it is extremely problematic to ever collect, or it's just not the right time to be thinking about that. But there are big segments of the debt and arrears which are, you know, related to overpayments or, you know, fraudulent claims or, you know, erroneous claims, all that type of thing. So what's the plan for, you know, tackling the bits of those arrears which we feel we might be able to, you know, appoint the specialist contractors to actually you know, address, because there could be quite a lot which I know when the council has tried to collect arrears previously from the appropriate segments of that debt, it tends to be pretty successful. So is there a program to sort of, you know, revitalise that process at some stage and for some limited parts of the debt?
Yeah. So across the board, really, we've recommenced recovery action. For example, council tax, we've started to issue reminders, which has seen an improvement in the collection rate. Unfortunately, I would say from previous history, some residents will only pay or engage with us once they receive a summons, some only when a bailiff knocks on the door. Just this week, we've had some updates from the magistrates' courts, and they will enable councils to have remote hearings, clearly putting the onus on local authorities to hold the hearings and deal with customers within our offices. So I'm putting together a draft plan for Caroline proposal to say that we need to consider recommencing summonsing council tax residents who haven't paid and haven't engaged with us, and subsequently obtaining liability orders. Business rates, last month we commenced with reminders, looking at the list of businesses that owed us money. Clearly a lot who weren't in a position to pay, and we've tried to engage with them to look to defer instalments and things like that. But when you looked at the list of businesses who hadn't paid, there was a lot there who clearly should have paid, retail outlets, things like that. So we've recommenced recovery on business rates. And it's funny because I'm looking at what the forecasts were back in June. The August figures are much better, and there has been an improvement in collection. So the forecasted shortfalls, if you like, for both council tax and business rates have improved. Sundry debt, again, we've recommenced issuing letters. We've now started to engage with commercial rent debtors to try to engage with them, get payments from them, defer, make payment arrangements, etc., etc. Perhaps one of the big areas, and Caroline mentioned it earlier on parking, we've been in discussions with the parking team. They are now starting to recommence the process of debt registration. They got over 4,500 debts where they've obviously, there's outstanding PCNs, they've engaged, no payments have been made, so they need to register these debts, escalate the recovery process and pass to, possibly pass to an enforcement agent at the end of that process if they haven't paid. Again, with parking in particular, a lot of people don't engage and will only pay when either we knock on their door or we clamp their vehicle. There's a proposal at the minute with Caroline on the recommencing of enforcement work. As Caroline mentioned earlier, the government allowed that to recommence late in August. We have to issue, in accordance sort of with best practice for the private bailiff industry, we have to issue certain letters to re-engage with all our debtors. We've done that. The proposal, hopefully if agreed, will see us recommence bailiff activity initially on parking debts from about the 5th or 7th of October. So there's lots of movement that's taking place. We've still been engaging with legal services on existing or outstanding debtors. As I said earlier, we had one sealed debt that's been outstanding with us for years of over £300,000 that was paid. I appreciate there's a lot of debt outstanding. I guess I want to reassure you that we have recommenced recovery action. We're trying to do it sensitively where we can, and trying to get that balance between dealing with customers who struggle to pay and engaging and helping them, and those customers who are avoiding paying and taking the appropriate action with them.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dave. That's really helpful. It's on parking debt, if I recall, from when there was a number presented on parking, it was about £4 million or something like that. It's quite a high number for uncollected parking debts. Yeah, there's a lot there, which, as you say, with your programs might bring some extra cash in. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Paul, then Nigel.
Thank you, Roger. David, can I press you a bit further on that? Those businesses that aren't able, who are really struggling, we have English language schools where, of course, they've seen a complete absence of students coming through, particularly those who fell the wrong side of decisions made on business rate relief and non-discretionary or discretionary grants. How far are we going to help them, knowing they are really, really struggling and they're important small businesses that need all our help? How far can we go?
So what we're doing at the moment, Councillor, is where they're engaging with us, and lots of them are, we're offering to defer their instalments. Now, initially, we started off at the beginning of the crisis. I think we started off deferring instalments to June. We're now at the stage where we're deferring instalments as far in the future as December. We're now giving, rather than saying you need to pay or we'll set your payment arrangement that sees you pay this year's business rates within the year, we're spreading those arrangements further on into next year. Now, I've had discussions with a couple of businesses myself, and whilst I've said to them we're happy to defer until December, if December comes and you're still not in a position to start to make payments, then contact us again and we'll look to defer again. At the minute, I'm not in a position to write off or waive any business rates debts, but we will try to help by deferring. And you don't know that perhaps in a few months' time, maybe the position will change, either that sees them able to open and start to earn money, or the government might take a different stance on reliefs and things like that with them. So we are engaging with them. We're trying to defer and help them as much as we can.
Thank you. Nigel.
No, I was going to say almost the same as Paul, but how much are you able to keep deferring the payments? You cannot just keep deferring it for a long time. Would you write it off, or would you start looking in a different option?
Yeah, I mean, at the minute, we're not looking to write any debts off. I mean, the council tax and the business rates are both due for residents and businesses that are liable to pay us. As I say, we're trying to engage as much as we can. I think we need to be realistic. We know that many of these businesses are still shut and are likely to be shut for, who knows, several months still in the future. And it may be that some of them aren't in a position to pay any rates this financial year. We will engage with them, and we can look to, once they are in a position to start paying, we can look to then make arrangements with them that might not be ideal for them. I think a lot of them don't want to pay any rates this year, and at the minute we're not in that position that we can do that. We will try to help them as much as we can. I was talking to a business just yesterday, and he's saying, well, I can afford to pay 30% of what you're charging me. I can't afford to pay the full amount. So my approach was, right, you tell me what you can afford to pay and how long you can afford to pay that. We'll set that arrangement up, and then 6 months' time, we can have another discussion about the position that you and your business are in and whether we can come to an agreement then with regards to the rest and how we can deal with a payment of that. It's just, you know, I appreciate the difficulty that a lot of them have had. They're still shut. They've had no income. As Councillor Kohler says, they haven't had any of the government help at all. But at the minute, we're not writing off or waiving any business rates.
Okay, thank you.
I think that only leaves Appendix 9, which is the updated HR position. Does anyone have any questions on that appendix? No. Okay, let us move on to the last item on the agenda, the work programme for the coming year. Can I just draw your attention to page 3, which is the last bit of the minutes, where at our last meeting, we did identify 4 items that we were going to consider as part of the work programming for the coming year. It was a make or buy review, capital budget programme, adult social care debt, and refresh of the target operating models. Now, those may be 4 items we wish to pursue. As Owen was making the case, there may be other items we wish to consider in relation to the modern regeneration, and indeed other items to do with COVID as well. I invite comments on what our work programme should be. Owen, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So I think there's essentially 3 sort of RDL issues, and they're the COVID expenditure. Actually, how much has this cost us? How much is this costing us on an ongoing, and trying to understand that. Then there's the COVID-related fall in revenues, really, and understanding that, which I think is probably, I don't know, might be easier to do, might be harder to do, I don't know actually. And then the plan to my long-term thing, which is the plan to increase revenues. But of the 4 that are currently there, I think that one, the minutes, I think only the make to buy is arguably a priority. And I think for want of a better way to say it, the risk to our regeneration plans is pressing. So there's my opening 5, and I await to see other people's views.
Well, you said you're opening 5. I only got 4. Corporate expenditure, COVID.
Fall in expenditure. Okay. Fall in expenditure because of COVID. Increase in expenditure because of COVID. Fall in revenue because of COVID. Plans to increase revenue in the medium and the long term. Then the make or buy, I think, is extant, and the risk to our regeneration project was number 5. So I think there would be my 5. I think actually, and before other people come in, I think once we've all given out 2 penneth-worth, I think actually it would be useful hearing off Colin and Roger and others as to where, if at all, we could add value, and where they would have numbers ready for any sort of inquiry, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does, and obviously we must be cognizant of the fact we're only talking about 3 meetings. But anyhow, Paul, did you wish to make a contribution?
I just like to. I wholly agree with Owen's previous comment. I think this is not a criticism of your chairing at all, but we spend our time just doing this sort of amateur auditing and asking questions. I don't think we add value at all during this process. I think we really need to start addressing the fundamental issues, and indeed asking officers how they would help at a political, not party political, but political level. I think this role where we simply go through pages and pages of accounts and ask trivial questions doesn't help anyone. I really think we need to reconfigure what we're doing here as a committee.
Fair enough. Thumbs up for Owen. Peter, would you like to contribute?
Yes, I partly disagree with Paul there because, you know, we have undergone a cataclysmic event since we last met, and I think we do need to begin to understand that through the questions we've asked. And I agree with Owen, we need to go on checking and understanding just how COVID is impacting on us in both costs and loss of revenue. Also, I have to say, regeneration of Morden has been around for as long as I've been a councillor, and from what has just been said, it seems further away than ever. So I really would like to look in some depth into that. So that really does.
Yeah, and the history and the timetable and so on, yeah.
Other comments?
I just like to add, I don't think, Peter, you and I were disagreeing at all then on all of that. I think we've got to raise above the detail and look at these issues.
If I may, Chair, I think it's about the practical application of what we do. So if you were to take those 5 items and the 2 of them are just a matter of, say, Caroline and her team reporting what they believe to be the costs, and we look at them. We don't interrogate those things to the same detail. We don't spend ages questioning why Caroline's got 33 in that column or whatever, but we just try and understand. And then where we place the sort of analysis and the synthesis is into, and hopefully ideas, is into the Morden regen. You know what I mean? Because what with the east-west gap, with the Morden regeneration, you know, and hopefully one day Mitcham regeneration, this is decades in the making, as you've just said, Peter. And this is, you know, by then even the Lib Dems could, you know, have a resurgence and be in power. Who knows? You know what I mean? So this has to be done. I'm only joking, Paul. That'll never happen. But the truth is, we do need to do it from a sort of non-party point of view, and actually, this is what we can agree on, and then take that to the full council so we agree on at least some things about the direction of our place.
Did you wish to add something?
Yes, I do. I think it's from what Owen is saying, I think it's very important that we get a full insight of what happens and what is happening, because the last time we met, it's a while ago. So therefore, and a lot of things have happened since then. So Caroline report is very important to us right now. And I think I had learned quite a lot from what Caroline has said. And I think, you know, other people may have also. So yes, so going with what Owen says about impact and COVID and things like that, I think that those are some of the things that we could take up for our next task group meeting.
Before I ask Caroline and Roger to comment, let's see if there's any more comments from colleagues. Ed.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that in terms of Owen's comments that, you know, COVID expenditure, impact on losses, I think all that information comes through in any event, through cabinet papers and scrutiny panels and the, you know, business plan and all that sort of thing. So I know Councillor Colour says he doesn't see the value in actually asking questions and talking about it, but these are such significant issues for our borough and the funding, and it enables us to properly understand them and go away and put pressure on you know, other sources and all this type of thing. Such a valuable exercise, I think, to go through these. They're very big numbers, and particularly this year because the impact. It's, I think, the ability for us to actually, you know, challenge the numbers, ask more questions, ask what isn't presented to us, I think is extremely valuable. And on the Morden generation, I couldn't agree more. I think we know the status of that project. It would seem to be off the table now. My question would be, if we are going to ask about the Morden generation, you know, is there a learning? How I heard Councillor Southgate says it's taken, you know, years and years and years and years and years. And, you know, one question is there a learning from that? You know, what has happened to make it take such a very, very long time? Is there a learning we can all take away from that? and see why it did take so long, because now it's just not available, it seems, because of the current situation and the time it's taken us to get us there. And I mentioned a couple of things like, you know, which I don't know, Councillor Pritchard says have already been done, but when you look at the CYP or the Children's Schools and Families budgets, and you see things like the EHCP plans, and maybe there are sites out there, I know it was said that we just don't have the sites, but you know, when we don't have the sites as a borough, we put you know, a search for sites out, and you might find that, you know, there are some available sites around the borough that do enable, you know, greater provision for additional needs provision and education, which might, you know, as you've got adverse impacts of about 10 to 12 million pounds a year in the council's budget, I think that should be a priority, you know, to look at, as matters like additional needs transported. Again, you get an annual 7-figure adverse impact. Is every single one of those carries an awful lot of adverse risk and financial impact, and those are exactly the sort of things that one of the scrutiny panels in some format really ought to be looking at as a priority, I think. So those are comments from my perspective. Yeah.
Thank you. So thanks, Ed. Nigel next, then Natasha, then Paul. You have to unmute yourself, Nigel.
I know. Which what about to talk about the grants, because there are some grants that the council have failed to apply for, and I think we should try and keep an eye on whichever the grants are available, and the council should try and take advantage and try apply as much as possible. Thank you.
Natasha?
Yeah, sorry, I mean, just a slight in defence of Councillor Kohler, I don't think he was saying let's not look at this in detail or pay any attention to anything. I just think that we do have a tendency to look very much at the numbers in terms of not whether or not they're, you know, sensible or not, but whether or not they plug into a strategy or plug into something a bit bigger. And I think, you know, if we were looking at school needs places and looking for calls for sites and stuff like that, that would take a more of a strategic look, and rather than looking at line items on a spreadsheet. I'd just like to say that I think I would much prefer that approach, and I would very much like to again look at the regen stuff that's come up today, because I think it's going to be the most pressing thing, I think, really, that comes out of this. It's a big red flag for us all, and if we had just kept our heads in the line items, we wouldn't have mentioned that today. So I think it's really important to keep taking a step back and seeing what this lad is up to.
Thanks, Natasha. Paul, then Owen.
Thank you, Natasha. Just to say, yes, exactly. And as any fair-minded person would know, Ed, I didn't say what you said I said. And my plea to you, yet again, is please don't use scrutiny to make party political points. We should be working together for the good of the borough, and put down your party political points and actually work together. It's tiresome when you go down that path.
Unless they're funny, obviously. Chair, but moving on to the Morden. Look, I think it's about horses for courses, right? This is the financial management task group. That is the regeneration ties in issues to do with our treasury plan, our investment plan, and it is key. Other things to do with the RDL, I don't think I've ever known us over the last 2.5 years to add value really, and to say, oh, actually, have you thought of this, really, when it comes to improving the way that incredibly capable directors and their teams run their programs efficiently, right? I just don't think that there has been one incident where we've turned around and go, oh, that'll save you, 100K or whatever. But understanding the strategic issues to do with SEND children and the like belongs in CYP, and that's part of it. But the number crunching that underlines it will be part of it, but won't be the overall. This particular task group is about financial management, and nothing is more to do with financial management and the big muscle moves of financial management than the treasury plan, than the CDEL, than the capital plans, than the regeneration, than the way all of that is going to impact upon what is one of our shared objectives, which is bridging the east-west divide, right? I don't think that anything is comparable. And ultimately, you know, this is the language of priorities. And I know we all care about all things, but this is the number one thing for this particular task group right now, as I see it.
I think it is now up to Caroline and Roger to perhaps comment. I think in summary, where we are is that we will, of course, still look at the quarterly returns at each of our meetings, because that's mandated in our terms of reference. But I think almost a challenge to Caroline and Roger is we want to spend less time looking at the quarterly updates. So the challenge is, in their presentation, can they make the presentation in such a way that we don't have questions to ask, because all the matters of import have been brought to our attention in the presentation. So that, you know, an easy challenge you to accept. Clearly, I think there is support amongst all members of the committee to have a look at the modern regeneration. And clearly we have to understand the impacts of COVID, which I think are slightly different from understanding that COVID is reflected in the quarterly updates. So against that kind of summary of where I think we are, Caroline, would you like to comment, please? And then perhaps Roger as well.
Just a reminder that my understanding is the Overview and Scrutiny Commission had asked for an update on COVID expenditure impacts to their November meeting. So whether that's still on course, or because I wasn't at that meeting where that work plan was discussed, so that could go there, or it could still come to the Financial Monitoring Task Group. So on the regen, I suppose to flag that, picking up on what Councillor Benbow was saying about alternative sources of funding, they are looking to see if we can get some Homes England funding to supplement some of the TfL funding that may not be available, or just shortfall of trying to get things over the line. So they are seeking additional sources of funding. So that may still be something that can come forward to then see what impact it may have on the ambitions and what it means about getting that joint venture partner together. I was going to say, just on the proposed work programme that was pulled together back in March, which does seem such a long time ago now, certainly the refresh of the target operating models, I don't think would be something that would be suitable, because we're not looking to do TOMs anymore. We do have a different approach to the service plans, so it's whether that's helpful as part of what will come to you more January time. So again, it depends. I don't have the dates of when the meetings are to work out when is the best time to have some of these items. And clearly we did talk about adult social care debt follow-up with some of the work that we've been doing with different either organisations trying to help us do collect debt, or using our own legal services team to collect debt. So with some of the issues we've seen around the debt that we have, whether that's still something you want to look at.
Well, do you want
I don't know if
Yep.
Roger wants to follow
yeah,
that.
well, obviously, Caroline sort of summarised it well. I mean, just my perspective on it is, I sort of get the regen bit, etc. Given your sort of title, Financial Monitoring Task Group, I would in many ways expect you to pick on areas within the financial updates that we're giving you, the monitoring reports, etc., for those areas of financial pressure that the council is facing. So I'm not surprised you want to look at things like COVID, You've asked questions about the DSG deficit, although I'm not sure whether it's more appropriately dealt with somewhere else. But it's those areas of financial pressure on the council that it would seem appropriate for you to want to have a deeper dive and a larger explanation on the impact of those. But as Caroline says, I think the things on the list in many ways have been superseded. And I'm sure that you've already had a review of the capital program before. So whether that's appropriate to come back to in the impact that COVID might have, and that might be something that you want an update on. But I wouldn't necessarily suggest that would be a deep dive. So they're the only comments I have, Chair.
I think from that, I would suggest that we drop the target operating models for the reasons Caroline said. I personally am not all that concerned about adult social care debt follow-up, because from everything we've heard, I have a great level of confidence in our debt management team. So I don't feel we have to be monitoring that particular aspect of debt management. It's getting us down into the details. So I would certainly drop that. I think perhaps that leaves us of the question which I'll ask Peter, which is if indeed COVID cost impacts and income impacts are coming to the Overview and Scrutiny Commission in November, do we as a group also want to look at it in November or indeed at another time? Do you have a view on that, Peter?
Yes, just thinking back a bit, when we, for a short time, suspended scrutiny altogether and then moved on to the sort of essential scrutiny, everything being done through the Commission, I was keen that we should indeed look at the financial implications of the situation we were in with COVID at one of those monthly meetings. Now that hasn't materialized. I think the right way now to look at this is as a context setting exercise for our November meeting on the budget, that we should understand where we are, if we indeed know, or there may still be a lot of unknowns in there in November. But I think there are wider implications. We can't yet know how patterns of employment will change. I mean, just looking at our figures on vacancies and agency workers, will suddenly rising unemployment figures start to change that picture? Will the whole move towards more working from home start to change the character of our borough and affect the way we'd look at the regeneration of Morden? I think there is such an appetite to look at the regeneration of Morden. So even if I'm just trying to square it with our remit, to be honest, Roger, and see how we can do that. But really understanding a major regeneration project such as this and all the complexities of working with partners, a dramatically or rapidly changing scene in the property and development market. I'd like to do that, and I sense that the enthusiasm for that is here, possibly more than in the Commission. I've perhaps ought to think about that a little bit more. Not making it up on the hoof like I am doing now as to why we can justify doing it here, but we really do want to find a way of doing that.
Okay, thank you. Natasha, then Owen.
Just to say, like, if we looked at it in any other committee, we would be looking at it kind of like from the, say, if it was SOSCOM's kind of the environment or the kind of the makeup of a place, we wouldn't be looking at how we would finance that or how the council could take ownership of some of that and what our position is within that. So I think this is actually the only place we could look at Morden Region in the context of its money coming from the council.
Okay.
If I can, I just think that Roger's point is, you know, the financial pressures, and I get that, right? And ultimately, the biggest thing, for all the reasons I said earlier, is the Morden Region. That's the most strategic thing, and what we need to look at is the financial pressures on it, right? Because it's not going to not go ahead because of any other reason. You know, that's why it's in doubt. That's why it's always been delayed. That's why it will be delayed further, is the finances. It's not, you know, it's not anything else. It's a financial issue that is stopping the regeneration, right? And fundamentally, that's why it belongs here. I understand, Peter, that you're thinking, oh, it could go over under scrutiny because it's a big thing and it touches on lots of areas, and it could come into SUSCOMs because there will be a housing element to it or whatever else. But really, the core of the points that I listed earlier to do with, and were brought up by Caroline, to do with why it's not going to happen, which are to do with the TfL budget, brought up by Ed, to do with the GLA budget, brought up to do with the PWLB, other borrowing sources. They are financial issues, right? So if we have to write the essay question as such that it is the financial pressures and financial viability of the Morden regeneration, so be it. But it belongs here.
I think, Peter, yes.
Yeah, just very quickly, let's bear in mind that the FMTG is a sort of subgroup appointed, if you like, by the Commission or requested by the Commission to look at these issues, and the Commission has the overarching responsibility for these big strategic questions, issues, if you like, that span across and affect large parts of the borough. So certainly the Commission is concerned with Morden Regen in that respect, and I think the financial aspects very happily sort of come down to the FMTG to explore.
We have 3 meetings timetabled on the 17th of November, the 16th of Feb, and the 20th of July. As a straw man, may I suggest that the November meeting looks at Morden Regen in addition to the quarterly report. The February meeting picks up the quarterly report and perhaps a more detailed exposition of the impacts of COVID on income and costs, and that we leave the additional item for the July meeting to be determined at a future date. Owen.
Chair, may I propose you flick that around? I think the most pressing thing that everyone needs to get their head around is the costs and the impacts of COVID, right? And although I've talked about the strategic issue, obviously they are financial, right? So a report on that. On that, in the same time, will, by flicking the financial viability of the Morden regeneration into the next meeting, I think will give more time for the dust to settle, perhaps with CSR and other issues and the like. So it will be a more informed picture.
Chair, if I may, I don't disagree with that necessarily. I think, but if you cover COVID in November, you may end up covering it again in February because it's an ever-changing position. And of course, if we get a second wave, I absolutely get your point, Councillor Pritchard. And it might be that that's what you do. I mean, as part of the monitoring report in February, inevitably COVID will play a key part, and you might be able to build on what you've already discussed in November, but we might not know elements of government funding and support and all that by then. So I mean, it's a moot point because I think at the end of the day,
if there are 3 dates, if I'm honest, I fully expect the first one to be COVID, the second one to be the regen, and the third one to be COVID.
COVID again, yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah.
Paul, did you have something to say?
I was just about to say exactly that. I'm sure that's right.
Okay. Yeah. So Caroline, how do you feel about that as an agenda in terms of it working for the corporate services team, who are obviously doing much of the legwork? If we do COVID in November, Regen in February, and COVID again in July.
Well, I would say Regen isn't really us, it would be the Future Merton team. Clearly there will be aspects of it, but they're the ones leading it, driving it. So I'm quite happy for them to just come along and do the February meeting, but we would need to touch base because they would be the ones doing certainly the heavy lifting on that. And I suppose it's just how much we pull out of the monitoring report separately for you to get your teeth into COVID in November and July. So we can certainly consider that and see what we do, because certainly I think for Cabinet we will still have the COVID separate analysis, because Cabinet will still need that.
I'll leave you to cogitate on that. Any other comments or observations?
I think just on the modern generation, when we do get to discuss it, it'd be great to know about the history, and because you to regenerate, you'd be looking at a traditional joint venture with not just public sector funds, but which are now off the table effectively from the GLA, TfL, but also housing associations and housing grant monies, which will still be available. But in terms of the other side of the joint venture, which is getting one of the big developers in to see what they can do in terms of shops and better housing as well, and that side, there's going to be a real question mark over their willingness to invest at the moment, given all the uncertainty. So you could always be back to the drawing board again on the modern regeneration, it seems, but we can go through that when we review the report and everything. Yeah.
Well, I think that concludes the discussion on future items. I'd just like to thank everyone for their contribution. I'd like to especially thank the officers, and also especially the officers who have attended, but were not actually called upon to speak because we didn't ask any questions relating to your areas of specialist knowledge. So apologies for that, but thank you very much for attending anyhow. So at this point, I declare the meeting closed. Thank you all very much for your attendance. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Good job.